The average internal combustion engine, your gasoline or diesel powered car, uses 32 kilograms of critical minerals. The average electric vehicle uses 210 kilograms. That is a six-fold increase. So the amount of materials we need for energy, clean energy, is going to be very significant. My name is Gracelin Baskaran. I am a mining economist, and I have spent 13 years working on critical minerals.
Baskaran is the founding director of the Critical Minerals Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She also teaches critical minerals at Georgetown University. Growing up in Michigan, the car industry and her geology professor dad helped spark an early interest in metals.
So after college, I did a Fulbright from the U.S. State Department in South Africa, and I ended up in the platinum belt. And I was so fascinated because platinum is actually primarily used for the catalytic converter in your car. And around the late 2010s, as we started thinking about moving to electric vehicles, platinum demand collapsed. And it became this really interesting time of what do you do with economies as they look for stability, but are really volatile because mineral cycles are inherently boom and bust. And that was the start. I went back, I did a PhD thinking about platinum, and now I think about minerals across the periodic table every day.
In fact, Baskaran admits to spending much of her free time examining minerals too, those still buried beneath the surface.
I love going to mines, and I love going to mines because there is so much you learn by being at the rock face. What are the other minerals located there? What are the challenges with extraction? Why do some projects succeed? Why do some fail, right? You don't realize, like, mining is a whole ecosystem. The water, right? There's an amazing project out in California. It's a rare earth project. They have a closed loop water system, and you don't understand how important that is when you're located in a desert until you go there. So I've spent time at mines all over the world. I try to get to mines at least a few times a year. So I've been to uranium, copper, cobalt, platinum, rare earths. And I'm a total dork, so it's great.
You're a mining geek?
Through and through.
So maybe we should start with this very simple question. How critical are critical minerals? I mean, why were they labeled as such?
So we historically have thought about minerals just as commodities, right? But unlike oil, which is also a commodity where if you have a conflict, oil prices will go up within 24 hours. We don't think about minerals with the same level of risk. But the reality is that minerals go into everything. They're your phones, your computers, your defense technologies, your semiconductors, your cars. So they're actually mission critical to every part of our economic, national, and energy security. Now, again, we kind of take things for granted, right? And for a long time, we didn't view them as being this really important policy priority. But about 3 years ago, China started imposing restrictions, and it actually limited our access. And it started with germanium and gallium, which you need for semiconductors and chips. Okay. Then it became graphite, which I need for electric vehicles. And then it became rare earths. And when those rare earth export restrictions went into effect, all the way from China, Ford had to stop manufacturing in Chicago. Wow. Japan had to stop manufacturing the Suzuki. Vehicle manufacturing in Europe. So all of a sudden we realized it wasn't about being, US versus China, but that any time you have supply chain concentration in one person's hand, you create a significant economic risk that affects factory floors worldwide and households, worldwide.
And so hence the criticality, the economic criticality. How would you compare this race to sort of countries trying to secure these minerals? How would you compare it to the oil rush in the late 19th century?
It's really interesting because the difficulty we have with minerals, when we think about critical minerals, like using the American list, there's 60 of them. So in a way, oil had the benefit, right? I mean, it's one commodity. It's generally concentrated in a handful of countries. Why, for example, OPEC became, the force that it was. Right. It's much harder to form a minerals cartel. And the geological distribution of minerals, I always say, you don't get to decide what minerals are under your feet. God did, right? Which meant that we are engaging with a set of countries that sometimes we've never engaged with commercially, particularly in Africa, certain Latin American countries. So the race for minerals, although really just as important, is far more complex and requires engaging with a far wider set of countries.
So governments have always, they use different things to sort of try and secure whatever they think is valuable. And one of the tools that they use is industrial policy. And you've written a lot about that kind of thing. And we've seen industrial policy in the mineral space at various moments where, copper was banned for consumer goods and, the government at some point committed to buying all this uranium, domestically produced uranium. But the U.S. especially is stepping up this industrial policy with minerals in mind, and Project Vault is a good example of that. So what is that project all about, and how does that sort of, represent what the government is trying to do these days?
So if we set the table on industrial policy was an icky word for a long time, right? It's kind of the antithesis of a free market. And a lot of us are free markets people in our bones. The thing that we forget is historically, a lot of countries have used industrial policy for a variety of industries. Japan subsidized Honda for a very long time before it became a profitable industry. I drove a Civic for well over a decade, so I've always appreciated that they did. I mean, it's a good, reliable car. I know we don't use Nokias anymore, but Finland subsidized Nokia for a long time, right, before it was a commercially viable technology company. So what we look at minerals, when we talk about the supply chain outside of China, it's very nascent. And when you have a nascent industry, it often requires support, which is exactly what industrial policy is. And it can take a variety of things. It can be a price floor, right, because we're not competing on the same floor as China. It can be subsidies in the form of grants to start processing facilities. It can be equity investments. And these are the tools it takes that hopefully you don't need forever. But until you let that industry develop to be able to compete on its own. One of the things we've realized, though, is that mining is not an overnight industry. Here in the United States, from the time that I identify a deposit to the time that I'm producing a mine is 29 years.
Wow.
Globally, it's 18 years. So it's not an industry that I can, snap my fingers and I've got a mine tomorrow. So it's a long-term effort to create a supply chain. What we are also acutely aware of, though, is at any point you can have a shock, you can have a disruption. So Project Vault is a stockpile. Historically, we have stockpiled for defense. Since 1939, the United States has had a defense stockpile. And most countries have some sort of defense stockpile in Europe, Japan, so on and so forth. What we've not had is an economic security stockpile for civilian technologies, which is that if there was a disruption, and it could be because a country cuts off access, it could be because there's a Strait of Hormuz disruption that nothing can get through. There's a variety of shocks, really, that our auto manufacturers, that our chip manufacturers, that our energy manufacturers could still continue manufacturing these various things that are critical. And so Project Vault is an effort to give our industries a layer of protection that if there was a disruption, they will not lose access to the materials to stop their manufacturing and therefore keep people employed. So it should really be viewed as an economic stability mechanism.
But how does it compare to other efforts, by other administrations in terms of securing valuable assets?
So historically, one of the challenges is that the U.S. has looked at minerals primarily through a defense lens, right? So the majority of our stockpiling was for defense. A lot of our mobilization of minerals and industrial policy was actually during wartime. Mm-hmm. People don't realize we've used very creative things. We once traded 1.6 million tons of bauxite with Jamaica in exchange for butter.
Wow.
We had surplus butter, so we gave them our butter and we got bauxite back. And we actually had passed legislation to allow us to do agriculture for mineral barters.
I have not read the butter bauxite paper.
We've gotten really creative over time. We've actually written about it. There's a paper called Minerals at War, where we look at how the U.S. has gotten really creative at times of conflict. What we've never really done, though, is think about our the rest of our economy outside of defense. And what happened in the last few years is it became very real to us that a shock could have a massive disruption to our manufacturing. If we had a gallium disruption, 30% gallium disruption could actually lead to about a 3% GDP disruption, right? There's become a material impact on our economic productivity. So Project Vault says, hey, mineral security is not just a national security imperative, it's an economic security imperative.
So you said something in an interview that I listened to with Foreign Policy back in December, And you said something that struck me when asked about, how quickly things were moving in the mineral space. You said that this year will never leave us. So what happened in 2025 that was so significant?
So in April 2025, China imposed rare earth export restrictions. Okay. And including in the United States, we actually could barely go 2 months before we ran out of rare earths. And it forced the United States to go negotiate with China 3 times last year in Switzerland, in London, and in South Korea to get access back to minerals. And we had to make concessions in our trade policy, for example, with semiconductors, that we wouldn't have made otherwise. What it really did is it instilled the importance that we can't rely on any one player for these minerals. And really, it's a lesson the Japanese learned in 2010, right? In 2010, there was a fishing trawler dispute. China cut off Japan, and Japan never forgot 2010. They have now invested. They have had the boldest minerals policy in the world for the last 16 years. I was at a rare earth mine in Namibia, and it turns out the Japanese owned 50% of that rare earth mine through increased equity, and they have aligned their financing with their offtake to ensure that when JOGMEC puts in financing, an equivalent amount of offtake comes back to Japanese companies. They've now started deep sea mining for heavy rare earths earlier this year. They've invested in processing projects around the world. So D-Day for the Japanese, right, was in 2010, and it still shapes their policy to this day. And 2025 was that for us. And that's where you saw the United States became the biggest shareholder of a rare earths company. That would never have happened 3 years ago. So it really hit home to us how vulnerable we were, and we never wanted to be in that position again.
So you're talking about rare earth minerals, and let's get a little bit into the nuts and bolts of how this is done. The world has been mining stuff for many, many years, and we know how to extract nickel and copper from the ground. But how much do we know about how to extract rare earth minerals that are sometimes thousands of feet underwater?
Mining rare earths, so there's deep sea mining and there's land mining, right? Okay. And deep sea mining for rare earths is brand new. Like Japan just started it in January. So it's like we're at a point where is that going to meet our large scale demand? Hard to tell, right? If we go to land-based mining rare earths is actually not the hard part. The hard part is processing. And this is where the real bottleneck is how do you take those rare earths, which often, like rare earths are everywhere. They're not actually rare. They're a little bit of a misnomer in that way. The difficulty is finding them in concentrations that are dense enough and then being able to separate that. And the rare earth separation process can involve upwards of 50 steps to get them to the purity that you need. And that technological know-how has historically been concentrated in China. Last year, when those rare earth export restrictions went into effect, China was processing 99.5% of heavy rare earths. Wow. And the world woke up to the fact that we didn't even know how to do some of this outside of China. So when I say that it's the industrial ecosystem, it's the technical know-how, it's the equipment, it's the technology, it's the energy for it that makes it very complicated.
So are there efficient and effective processing plants of rare earth minerals outside of China now?
We are building them. So within about a month of those restrictions, there's an Australian company called Linus that actually began separating them in Malaysia. And we are building our processing capabilities here in the U.S., out in California and out in Texas. But like I said, it's not an overnight industry. So we remain concentrated in the hands of a single country for some time to come.
So you just mentioned seabed mining, which exposes the geopolitics of the mineral space, with especially recently the U.S., starting to think about mining in what the International Seabed Authority claims are international waters. So how big a deal is that in terms of the geopolitics?
Deep sea mining is complicated, and there's 2 primary reasons. So historically, deep sea mining has primarily been done in kind of a lab environment, and you can control a lot of factors. The deep sea is not as homogeneous in the distribution of minerals as maybe a lab is. Mm-hmm. So while deep sea mining companies have claimed that they're at the bottom 20% of the cost curve, the reality is at a commercial scale, we don't know yet. And ultimately, this is all a cost game. I can mine anything. The question is, how do I do it profitably? So that's one challenge. The second challenge are maritime security implications. A lot of the ships that might do deep sea mining could be dual use, right? Civilian and military. And you have one maritime security incident that needs to happen before a lot of this goes on pause. And the U.S.'s executive order on deep sea mining didn't actually speak to maritime security very much. So that's the second thing. And I guess the third thing, too, is how do you process all of these? We don't have nodule processing capabilities yet. So not only do I have to extract the nodules, I then have to process it, and that takes time to build. So it's a high potential area, but the short answer is we don't know yet. And it's going to be one of those things that plays out within the next few years.
Okay, and maybe sticking to geopolitics, Africa has a huge role to play in the mineral space, always has. But Africans generally have not really benefited from their abundant resources. In fact, it's sometimes described as a curse. What are the chances, do you think, that Africa will potentially benefit from this now race to gain control of some of these critical minerals on the continent?
So the mineral scramble of the last few years has seen the world take a very different approach to Africa. Africa has historically been an aid baby. And then it became a kind of a low-value trade, like T-shirt manufacturing in places like Ethiopia,
low-skilled work.
Yeah, low-skilled work, right? No value addition. All of a sudden, you're seeing the whole world look at the African continent through what we would call commercial diplomacy. And commercial diplomacy could be a game changer. We're talking about a continent that there's many countries that are having serious debt challenges. You have a population that is growing rapidly. By 2050, 1 out of every 4 people in the world will be in Africa. You have a continent that has very little energy, which, by the way, is a problem for mining because it's very energy intensive. But 75% of the world's population that doesn't have energy are in Africa. So you have a lot more countries demanding for a better way of doing mining. And you see this because in the last couple of years, countries like Namibia, Zimbabwe, Ghana have imposed mineral export restrictions, right? If you're not doing processing here, it's not leaving the country. Now, 100%, the beauty of competition, right? Because Japan, Middle Eastern countries, Australia, Canada, the US, China, everybody wants Africa's resources. There's some world-class resources. This means that when there's competition, countries get to decide who they're going to work for, and they're looking for the best value proposition for their resources. Yeah. So it opens up a real opportunity. But at the same time, it's also dependent on African countries willing to adopt stable governance. And I'll take you back to 2019, Zambia, which has good mineral reserves. They had a challenging administration that increased their royalty for like the 16th time in 10 years, that rolled out double taxation where raw minerals, you had to tax them to bring them in and you process them and you tax them back out. Yeah. And there was a massive drop-off in investment. Is you want to develop policies that have good benefit sharing, but that also have stability. That, hey, I'm going to build this policy, this tax policy, and then for the next 10 years, it's going to stay this way. Yeah. And then as a government, we're going to take these resources and we're going to reinvest them into physical capital. So that's infrastructure, energy,
so people
roads.
will benefit from it.
100%. Yeah. Human capital. Are we educating people from, primary education all the way through, university? And natural capital. Are we still protecting the environment? And if you can develop those policies, you develop an incredibly investable environment where people benefit, there's benefit sharing, but it requires stability and longevity, which is a little bit of a struggle right now.
And so with all this wheeling and dealing and investment into mining, when it comes down to sort of trying to secure these minerals and making these deals, should, in your opinion, public funds be used to finance mining projects that the private industry sometimes think is too risky?
Public funds are well used on some of what we call the mining ecosystem. And what I mean by that is primarily infrastructure. It's a tough proposition to get a mining company to come in and finance a mine, the road, the rail, the port, the energy, the water. It makes what could be a good project, it makes it economically unviable, right? So where you see that public funds could be well utilized is to build energy that not only supports a mine, but also supports the livelihoods of people, water, infrastructure that's dual use. So there's strategic places to deploy public capital that can incentivize mining without necessarily subsidizing a miner when there's other competing fiscal interests.
All right. So finally, if world powers manage somehow to sort of parse out all the concessions and the potential for all this mining of these critical minerals, what are the chances that these critical minerals help us move away from fossil fuels?
So if you look at the biggest drivers of mineral demand, they are primarily energy, clean energy technologies. So I'll give you an example. The average internal combustion engine, your gasoline or diesel powered car, uses 32 kilograms of critical minerals. The average electric vehicle uses 210 kilograms. That is a six-fold increase. When you look at the drivers of demand, it is cars, it is solar, it is wind. So the amount of materials we need for energy, clean energy, is going to be very significant. And there will be no clean energy without these materials. So it offers enormous potential, but it requires a lot more mining and processing than we currently have.
Gracelin Baskaran is the director of the Critical Mineral Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Look for the Cafe Economics piece based on our conversation in the June issue of Finance and Development magazine. Go to imf.org/F&D. And look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts, on YouTube, or wherever you listen. You can also follow us on X. Our handle is @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.